What if the most feared trade secret in Renaissance Europe wasn't a weapon, but a window? In 13th century Venice, men were quietly moved to an island and warned that if they ever left the Republic for good, someone might be sent to make sure they never taught what they knew. Picture the lagoon at night. A furnace glows orange behind shuttered brick, throwing heat into the wet air until the fog itself seems to shimmer. Inside, a gaffer turns a long iron pipe, and at the tip of it, a blob of molten glass breathes like something alive, stretching, sagging, catching the light. The air smells of wood smoke and hot mineral, faintly sweet, like a beach after lightning. Outside, a boat waits at the dock, and the man loading it keeps glancing over his shoulder because he has heard the stories. That the Republic of Venice does not simply let its glassmakers walk away. This was the island of Murano, and by the late 13th century, Venice had made a decision that still puzzles historians about how far a government will go to protect a craft. Records show that in 1291, the Venetian Senate ordered every glass furnace in the city moved out to Murano. The official reason was fire. Venice was built of wood and stone patched tight along canals, and a furnace fire could take half the city with it. But the timing and what followed tell a more complicated story, because Murano wasn't just safer, it was easier to watch. To understand why Venice guarded this craft the way other nations guarded gold, you have to go back much further than the lagoon. Back past the Crusades, past Rome, back to a substance so common that almost nobody who ever walked on it imagined it could become clear. Glass begins, most simply, with sand, silica, melted at extreme heat until it stops being a solid and becomes something in between, a liquid that forgets to flow. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder told a story, centuries after the fact, that Phoenician traders camping on a beach near the Belus River rested their cooking pots on blocks of natron, and the heat of their fire fused the sand beneath into glass. Legend has it, this is how glass was discovered, but historians today treat this as legend, a good story rather than a verified event, because natural fires simply don't reach the temperatures required. But the tale survives because it captures something true about how glass actually was discovered, not through genius, but through accident, heat, and time. What the archaeological record does show, with more confidence than Pliny's campfire, is that glassmaking as a controlled craft appears in Mesopotamia and Egypt, historians believe around 2500 BCE, first as glazes on beads and small ornaments, luxury items reserved for the powerful. For roughly 2,000 years, glass stayed thick, colored, and precious. Vessels built slowly around a core of clay and dung, then scraped clean once the glass cooled. It was jewelry. It was not yet a window. The moment that changed everything happened quietly. Sometime around the 1st century BCE, somewhere along the Syro-Palestinian coast, someone discovered that if you dipped a hollow tube into molten glass and blew, air itself could shape it. Archaeological finds of early blowpipes and waste glass in Jerusalem point to this region as the birthplace of glass blowing. It sounds small? It was not small. Blowing glass meant a single worker could produce in an afternoon what once took a specialist days to build by hand. Suddenly, glass wasn't rare anymore. It was fast, cheap, and everywhere. And Rome, expanding across 3 continents, spread it faster than any craft before it. By the 1st and 2nd centuries, glass windows appeared in the villas of the wealthy, glass cups replaced pottery on Roman tables, and glass bottles carried wine and oil across the empire's shipping lanes. But here is the open thread worth holding on to. None of this glass was clear. Roman glass was greenish, bubbled, faintly cloudy, because the sand itself carried iron impurities nobody yet knew how to remove. True transparency, glass you could see through the way we take for granted today, was still more than 1,000 years away. And the empire that had spread this craft across the known world was about to lose it almost entirely. When Rome fell in the west during the 5th century, glassmaking didn't vanish everywhere. It retreated. Byzantium in the east kept the tradition alive in its churches and workshops. And in the expanding Islamic world, from Damascus to Baghdad, chemists and craftsmen pushed glass chemistry further than Rome ever had, experimenting with new colorants, new clarity, techniques that would later cross back into Europe through trade and, eventually, through conquest. This is a detail often left out of the story. For centuries, the finest glass on earth wasn't made in Europe at all. Then, in 1204, something happened that would hand Venice its opening. Crusader armies, diverted from their original mission, sacked Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium. And in the chaos and looting that followed, craftsmen, including glassworkers, scattered west. Some historians trace a direct line from this displacement to the sudden flourishing of glass skill in Venice over the following century. Venice, sitting at the crossroads of Byzantine and Islamic trade routes, absorbed knowledge the way its lagoon absorbed the tide, quietly, constantly, until it had more of it than anyone else. By the time the Senate ordered the furnaces onto Murano in 1291, Venice already understood something its rivals hadn't yet grasped. Glass wasn't just a craft, it was leverage. And leverage, once you have it, is worth protecting at almost any cost. The century that followed sharpened that protection into something closer to obsession. Venetian glassmakers were given privileges most craftsmen could only dream of. The right for their daughters to marry into noble families, tax exemptions, a status just below the patriciate itself. But the privileges came bound to a warning. Records show that later Venetian decrees, including one recorded in the mid-15th century, explicitly forbade glassworkers from taking their craft abroad, under penalty that could include the confiscation of family property left behind in Venice, and, according to some accounts, far worse for those who refused every order to return. This is where the legend sharpens into something almost cinematic, and where historians today ask us to slow down and separate fact from folklore. Legend has it that the Council of Ten, Venice's secretive security body, dispatched agents to track down and even assassinate glassmakers who fled to foreign courts and refused to come home. It is a story repeated in countless retellings of Murano's history, but historians studying the actual Council of Ten archives have found the documentary trail for specific assassinations thin at best. Threats, surveillance, and legal penalties are well documented. Confirmed killings of named defectors are much harder to pin down. Whether the Republic ever actually spilled blood over a trade secret, or whether the threat alone did all the work, is something historians still debate. And that uncertainty is worth sitting inside for a moment, because it changes how we should read everything that came before it. We've been telling this story as if Venice were an empire willing to kill for a formula. But what if the truth is stranger, and in some ways more human? That the real danger to Murano's monopoly was never assassins in the shadows, but something far more ordinary. Here is the turn. The glass secrets everyone imagined were locked in a vault were, in practice, taught every single day, openly, to apprentices, many of them foreign-born, working under Venetian masters for years to learn the trade legally, as guild law required. Angelo Barovier, a Murano glassmaker credited around the 1450s with perfecting cristallo, the clearest glass Europe had ever produced, achieved this breakthrough not by hoarding a single magic formula, but by refining an existing technique, purifying the ash used to melt the sand, and adding manganese to cancel out the greenish tint left by iron impurities, a trick glassworkers nicknamed glassmaker's soap. That knowledge did not stay locked in one family. It spread, generation by generation, master to apprentice, the way all craft knowledge eventually spreads, no matter how many decrees try to stop it. So, the secret was never really a secret. It was a set of skills, refined over decades, protected by law and fear on paper, but carried out into the world anyway, through marriage, through trade, through the simple fact that skilled hands are hard to keep on an island forever. And nowhere is that clearer than in what happened 2 centuries later, in France, in a move that had nothing to do with assassins and everything to do with a king's ambition. By the 1660s, Louis XIV's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, wanted France to stop paying Venice for mirrors, an enormous drain on the royal treasury since Venetian mirror glass was, at the time, unrivaled anywhere in Europe. Colbert arranged for Murano glassworkers to be recruited to France, some through legitimate offers, to help establish a royal manufactory. In 1665, the Manufacture Royale de Glace de Miroir was founded outside Paris, the enterprise that would eventually become the company known today as Saint-Gobain. Venice reportedly protested through diplomatic channels, but by then the knowledge was already crossing the Alps in the heads of the men who carried it, not in a smuggled book of formulas. France's answer to Venice wasn't just to copy the blown glass method, it was to invent something better. French craftsmen developed a technique for casting molten glass onto large flat tables, and rolling it into sheets far bigger than anything a glassblower's lungs could produce. The result, completed between 1678 and 1684, still stands in the Palace of Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors, its walls lined with hundreds of mirror panels reflecting daylight down a gallery over 200 feet long. Visitors who stand in it today are standing inside the very moment Venice's centuries-old monopoly quietly, finally, broke. Notice the shape of what actually happened. Not a knife in a Roman alley, not a body pulled from a foreign canal, a king's minister, a recruitment offer, and a bigger table. The most feared trade secret in Europe fell not to violence but to capital, patience, and a better casting technique. That is the twist worth sitting with. The empire of fear was, in the end, undone by something almost mundane. Venice didn't disappear from the glass trade after this. Murano still produces extraordinary work today, its furnace is still burning, its craftsmen still training apprentices in techniques that trace back centuries. But it was no longer alone, and it was no longer the only place in the world that could make the world transparent. The pace of change only accelerated from there. In 1674, in England, a glassmaker named George Ravenscroft patented a new formula using lead oxide instead of the usual ash-based recipes, producing a heavier, more brilliant glass that sparkled under candlelight in a way Venetian cristallo couldn't quite match. This lead crystal became the foundation of English and Irish cut glass, still prized today in the very antique shops that call it crystal, without necessarily knowing where that particular sparkle came from. For most of history since, though, glass stayed strangely handmade for something so central to modern life. Sheets cast, rolled, and ground by hand, expensive enough that ordinary homes made do with small panes long after the wealthy enjoyed floor-to-ceiling windows. That changed only in 1959, when Alistair Pilkington, working for Pilkington Brothers in England, introduced the float glass process, floating molten glass across a bath of liquid tin, so it cooled into perfectly flat sheets without ever touching a mold or a polishing wheel. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but it is the reason nearly every window, storefront, and car windshield on Earth today is made the same way, at a cost so low that clear glass, once a secret worth guarding with your life, became one of the cheapest materials in existence. And the story didn't stop at windows. In the 1960s, chemists at Corning Glass Works developed a chemically strengthened glass through a project they called ChemCore, ahead of its time and initially shelved for lack of a clear market. Decades later, that same research became the foundation for what we now call Gorilla Glass, first used commercially starting around 2007, the same year the first iPhone reached the public, meaning that somewhere in your pocket, right now, there may be a direct descendant of a formula first tested in a lab half a century earlier, waiting for a use nobody could yet imagine. It's worth pausing on why any of this still matters, beyond trivia for a dinner party. Every time you look through a window, check a phone screen, put on a pair of glasses, or watch light travel down a fiber optic cable carrying the very video you might be listening to right now, you're relying on the same basic principle Roman glassblowers stumbled onto with a hollow tube and a lungful of air, that sand, heated past its limits, can be convinced to let light through instead of stopping it. The material that once required a state's death threats to protect now quietly holds together the entire architecture of how modern life sees, communicates, and understands itself. So much of this story turns out to be about control that never really worked, and secrets that were never quite as secret as the fear around them suggested. Venice built an island, wrote laws, and let rumors of assassins do work that assassins themselves may rarely have needed to do, and still, the knowledge got out, carried not by spies, but by ordinary apprentices, ordinary marriages, ordinary ambition. What actually broke the monopoly wasn't violence. It was a bigger casting table, a smarter minister, and, centuries later, a bath of molten tin that made clarity cheap enough for everyone. Somewhere between a Venetian campfire that probably never happened and a smartphone screen that definitely did, sand learned to disappear into light. So the next time you catch your own reflection, or watch a window catch the last color of a sunset, it might be worth asking what else around you feels ordinary today, but once was guarded like a state secret worth killing for. And what, in our own time, might someone 200 years from now be just as amazed we ever managed to keep to ourselves? Main sources for this story include the Corning Museum of Glass Historical Archives, the writings of Pliny the Elder as translated in modern editions of natural history, and historical accounts of Venetian glass regulation drawn from scholarly histories of Murano. The full list is in the description.